Hi, this is Tibor Lak. I am a retired aerospace engineer. I've worked on the space program for over 40 years. And I prepared a presentation on Noah's flood, Ice Age, the age of dinosaurs, and the division of the continents. I know you will like it because I am giving you evidence and proof of what happened from a biblical perspective that you will not find in the evolutionary material. Please listen to it. Your whole view of the Bible and Noah's flood will change forever. Thank you and enjoy it.
Well, good. Okay, good morning. I'm so glad you came because I can tell you that your view of the Noah's flood is not going to be the same after you hear this message. It is not a rehash of other theories and discussions on Noah's flood and all the other things, the age of dinosaurs and the continental divide. I threw that in as the fourth item, so I have a lot of material, so I'm going to have to, at some point, start picking up the pace. But all of this and the death of dinosaurs, all of this happened at once. And you'll see the evidence is very strong. And what else do I want to say? I want to give you a little bit of a foretaste on each of those four areas so that you don't tune out, because some of the parts may be a little bit boring, especially when we go to the part where we say, well, what does the Bible say about when the Noah's flood occurred? So that's a little bit maybe dry, but I want to show you that in the Noah's flood, what God has said and what is there, basically God tells us how the flood occurred. It wasn't just a big, a mega storm that happened. This was a huge catastrophe. And I think you'll appreciate when you see some of the evidence that things were blowing up left and right. And I want to show you where the water came from. The Bible says where the water came from, and it also says where the water went. But I want to show you the analysis that I did, and my background is analysis in fluid mechanics and thermodynamics, to show how that actually happened in the time. So that's going to be interesting. And then I want to talk, one of my favorite part is the Ice Age. I want to show you the discoveries that have been made on Antarctica, the ice sheet, and in Greenland. They measure the temperature of the ice, and it really shows that this was a super unique event. It wasn't some kind of a cold winter year after year, but this was a unique event. And I'll show you that it happened at the time of the flood. It's there. And I want to talk about the dinosaurs. And there are a lot of new recent discoveries about soft tissue in dinosaurs, in carbon-14 in dinosaurs, which all point to the fact that these dinosaurs didn't live hundreds of millions of years ago, but they lived less than 50,000 years, because after 50,000 years, all the carbon-14 decays into nitrogen. So if you find carbon-14 in dinosaurs, it has to be less than 50,000 years. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about other things that's really unique. And then the fourth part is the continental divide, the drift. The Bible actually talks about that after the flood, and it gives the date for that. So I'll show you that it doesn't take hundreds of millions of years for these continents to move apart, and yet it is a critical part of the whole story of the flood. How animals got to the ark and how they were able to get to the remote parts of the world. So that's kind of like a little summary of what I'm going to be talking about. Now, why am I here? Because I feel that this is such an important subject for young people to understand what the Bible says, because we've been intimidated by the theory of evolution that implies that everything happened millions and billions of years ago, and yet the Bible says, no, this happened thousands of years ago. So there's this big disconnect. And there's a tendency for us to kind of go with the flow and say, well, they have to be right after all. Look at all the super animation they have. It's like a Hollywood production. You see things blowing up, but it's not correct. There's no science behind it. So that's what I want to show you. Why are you here? Because I think you want to know. I think you feel like you don't have an adequate answer about what the Noah's flood and these things happened. So we're in good shape. I want to talk, you want to listen. So let me start. And at the end, hopefully if I stay on track, we'll have a question and answer, so you can ask your questions, and I'll try to answer your questions. The program said it's a fresh scientific look at the Noah's flood. Now, this almost sounds like a contradiction. Science and the Bible. How can that be a fresh look? But what I'd like to tell you is that a scientific investigation is one where you look at the evidence and the theory and you try to bring the two together. I've been fortunate enough that I've participated in a number of failure investigations. I came from the space program. I worked on the space shuttle, the Apollo program, Advanced Launch System, and other things for about 40 years. And my background is in analysis and thermodynamics. So I wrote a lot of the programs that are still being used there. So I have a good, strong basis on analysis. So one of the things when I was doing a failure investigation, and I participated in a number of them, was you have an event, a rocket blows up, you have recorded data, and then you have pieces of the rocket that's evidence. So in a failure investigation, you have to go in and be open-minded, not open-minded, but be disciplined to say, well, I have to look at all the data. I have to make sure that the data that is out there, the recorded data and the hard evidence, all fits in with my theory. It's a discipline that you have to exercise, because there's a tendency, and it always happens, that somebody comes up with a theory and says, well, this is what happened. And so they say, well, this part of the evidence, we're just going to ignore, but you can't. You have to include it, and if you do, you come up with the right answer, right scenario. So looking at the flood is like a failure investigation. We were not there. There are pieces of recorded data in the Bible, and then there's evidence in terms of fossil records, ice sheets, and things like that. So we have to make sure that these two actually complement each other and they're in agreement. So that's what I mean by a scientific investigation and study of the flood. So some of the things that I'm going to be pointing this out as we go is, when I say evolutionist, I'm thinking about not just theory of evolution, but the secular scientific community that does not accept the Bible as fact. I do. They don't. So what are some of the things they actually outright come out and say, well, we don't know this. And these are some of the things that I'm going to be talking about that they don't have an answer for. And in the back, I'll have a score sheet that shows the 17 items that the evolutionists don't have an answer, and the Bible exactly explains what happens. So one of the things is that, as we'll talk about, is that 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was all green. People lived there, animals, vegetation, and then in a twinkling of an eye, and this is some of their words, the whole thing changed. It went from a green Sahara to a desert with hundreds of feet of sand, completely covered them. So what happened? They don't talk about that. They don't talk about permafrost. Permafrost is a mixture of ice and silt. And in permafrost, we find prehistoric animals, mammoth, bisons, and are all covered in this permafrost. And occasionally, as the permafrost melts, these prehistoric animals just pop out and they find them. And recently, this is a recent discovery, less than 10 years, they found that there was also dinosaurs in the permafrost, which is not supposed to be there because, there's a big difference in the evolutionary theory between when dinosaurs lived 65 million years ago and when prehistoric animals lived about 40,000 years ago. There's also things that is not mentioned, is that there's a lot of emphasis, and you studied this in school and hear about it, that the last mass extinction was 65 million years ago, but yet we find fossilized mammals in sandstone that are dated, according to them, to be much more recent, a couple of million years ago, not 65. So how does that fit into the picture? Also, I'm going to talk to you about evidence of prehistoric civilizations that all came to an end around 2400 BC, which is what I'll show you, is when the flood occurred. It suddenly, a number of the civilization, the Egyptian, the Mesopotamian civilization, they all came to an end, and they didn't recover for hundreds of years. I think I mentioned that already. So I'm going to address all these questions about the things that are evidence that needs to be incorporated into the theory. And you'll see that the Bible answers these things, and the evolutionists do not have an answer. Just a brief thing about my background. As I mentioned, my background is in thermodynamics. I wrote a number of the programs that is still being used on the Space Shuttle program and advanced systems. I wrote this program, this general fluid transfer model. It was the first patented computer program that we got a patent on. And what this is a set of analytical equations that describes fluid processes that later on can be used to analyze a complex system. I have 11 patents on launch system design improvements. In 1990, I was named Rockwell Engineer of the Year. And then later in 1998, I was named a Boeing Technical Fellow. And the Boeing Technical Fellow is a person who is recognized to have a certain expertise. My expertise was in thermodynamics. I was also a member of the Failure Review Oversight Board. We were looking into sea launch failures. Sea launch was a rocket system that launched rockets from the equator, and they had a number of failures, so I participated in those. So, with my background, and I wasn't trying to boast here, I just wanted you to show that I do have qualifications. I do know how to do analysis, because those are some of the things I'm going to point out that you can do yourself and show that the evidence is in support of the biblical flood. So this part is going to be a little bit dry, but I'll try to go through it quickly. And because what it is that I'm going to go through and show when the flood occurred. When was it? Does the Bible say? Now, there are certain critics who say, no, you can't tell when the flood occurred because these are myths. Some of the things that they can say why you can't do it, because they say that the genealogies that are in the first chapter 5 of Genesis, it uses the word son, Ben, and therefore he said, well, you can't say that a person, the word son, means a direct descendant. It could mean a grandson, a great-grandson, some distant relative. So they say, well, you can't use the genealogies. And there are gaps in the genealogies. And usually what they refer to is a passage from the New Testament that says that the book of generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And of course, we know that Jesus was not a direct son of David. He was a descendant in the line of David. So they say, well, see, you can't use the word son. So if you see son, it's not good. And the other criticism they have is that the Bible gives a timeline when a particular patriarch had a descendant. And they said, you can't add these years because they never give you the right, because the Bible doesn't give you you can't add it. So I always say, well, why not? Who said that? Is there a warning in the Bible that if you add these years, you're going to get a migraine headache? There's nothing in the Bible about not adding it. So just quickly show you the passages. And I want to give you here, you may not be able to catch this real time, but maybe when you go back, you can record the references. But these are the references that allows you to calculate the time from the creation of Adam to the birth of Christ. It's continuous. There's no gap in it. So here's the first instance where, let's see if I can do this right. Okay, it's not working, but the first one is where Adam's son is born, and his name is Seth, and it says, begot Seth in his own likeness. So we know in the story that Seth was actually Adam's son. It wasn't some distant relatives. The other place we find it is on the birth of Noah. It says that Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son, Noah. Now, again, we know that he's the descendant, but the other key word here is that it was Lamech who begot Noah. It wasn't somebody else who got Noah. It was he who got Noah. All these other references above it talk about the fact that the patriarch begat. And they were doing the begetting. It wasn't somebody else doing the begetting for them. So with this, there's no gap, and it's okay to add the years. So from Adam to the flood is 1,656 years. So let's go from there. From the flood to Jacob is 452 years. So again, you still continue after the flood. You still have the begetting. And then when you get to the birth of Isaac down here, it says that Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. This is the third time, the only three places that the word Ben appears. But we know that in all of those cases, Ben meant a direct descendant. And so next, this is a plot of, if you add those years, when the patriarch had their descendants, you come up with this time, and it's from Adam to Jacob, to the birth of Jacob, is 2,100 years. Continuous, no gaps in that. And of course, this history is longer than our history from the birth of Christ. We're still about 2,000 some years. This is 20, so it's a lot of time. And here again, you can see the references that are there to come up with these dates. So we go on, and now from Adam to Jesus, when you calculate it, I came up with 4,088 years. Bishop Usher came up with 4,004 years. I looked at what he did, and I think I saw where he made a mistake. Who am I to say that? But either way, whether it's 4,004 or 4,088, we're talking about the same number. We're not talking about tens of thousands of years. So, I'll give him credit. He was a wise person. But these are the references. From Adam to the flood is 1,656 years. From flood to Abraham is 292. And in the yellow, I'm showing you the date with respect to the birth of Christ, 2100 BC. Then from Adam to Jacob, 160 years, and that Jacob was born 1980 years before Christ. Now, what happens is that those people who say, well, you can't use the genealogies because they are not complete after Jacob, and they're right. But you have other things that you use. You don't use genealogies, you use events. So from Jacob, you use the event. You have Jacob entering Egypt, which and the children of Israel leaving Egypt. So we're looking at 560 years. So this is the event, and these are the references there. So now we're at 1420 BC. Then from Exodus to Solomon, it gives the date from when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, and when Solomon dedicated the temple, it gives the number of years. So again, it's continuous. It's not genealogies anymore, but it's events. Okay, and then this is a little bit, it's on an eye chart, apologize about that, but after the death of Solomon, you have the two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. And the history, actually, you can calculate the number of years between the two kingdoms, and it's 391 years. And now we're at 513 BC. And then you have the 70-year captivity, and after the captivity, 70 years captivity, these are the references that gives you the years to come up to the birth of Christ. So 512 years, and we're there. So the total years from Adam to Jesus is 488 years. Now there's another, I like to use sanity check. You know, as an engineer, when we come up with an analysis, we have to make sure that we didn't do some mistake. So we have to have a different way of calculating it so we can verify that our first answer was correct. So this is a kind of a sanity check. You have the secular date of reign of Solomon, which is 965 BC. And then you also have the secular date for Abraham, which is 2128. So you can take those dates and go back, count backwards using the Bible references to see when the flood was. And it comes out, these dates come out to within 35 years of each other, and the date, if you calculate it, from Adam to Christ. So again, it's very powerful evidence to show that the date is really about 2,400 years before Christ. This particular chart I like. It's maybe a little bit busy, but what I'm showing you here is the history that's recorded in the Bible. The yellow parts of the graph represents when the patriarchs had their descendants and how long they lived, and going on to Jacob, and then you have the events of the Exodus, the kingdom division, and being carried off to exile. One of the things I want to show you here, which is, I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but you can see the divisions here in 1,000-year divisions. You have 1,000 years after Adam, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years after Adam. Now, what's significant about this is that in the beginning of each 1,000 year, you have a covenant that God makes with the people. The first one is with Adam. The second one is with Noah, and that covenant is about 1,100 years from Adam. And then the third covenant is with Abraham. Now, this is where God makes a covenant with Abraham. Abraham is born before the end of the second 1,000 years. And what's amazing about that is he's born 1,940 years after the birth of Christ, the birth of Adam. And what's unique about that is that if you look at it, Israel became a nation 1,948 years after the birth of the last Adam. So I don't think it's coincident. I think it's there. God has prepared this and planned this ahead of time. But then you go to the third one. After the beginning of the 3,000 year, you have the covenant with David. And then the 4,000 year, you have the covenant with the church, Jesus Christ's covenant with the church. This is kind of just on a side note. Those dates to us look ridiculous. A 900-year average, this is a plot of the longevity of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah to Shem, etc. And they all, before the flood, the average is about 930 years. That to us seems ridiculous. And some people have said, well, those are not real years. They're exaggeration, or there's a different calendar. It's a lunar calendar versus solar calendar. But the data shows that after the flood, something happened that the longevity of people suddenly dropped down. Within about 400 years after the flood, the life expectancy now is about 200 years. And it continues, and of course now I think the average life expectancy is at 70 or so. So the Bible is continuous, is showing this information that something drastic happened here. This is a chart that I pulled from Dr. Hugh Ross's presentation. And the reason I point this out because I was debating whether I should show it or not, but he has done something that is, he's a fine Christian, but I think he's doing something that is not consistent with the Bible. If you see here on the red, this is the date from Adam to Abraham, that little area, about 4,000 years. But what he has done, he's extrapolated. He took the date for Abraham, and he did an extrapolation saying that Peleg, this guy who we'll talk about when the earth was divided, that he lived at 10,000, 11,000 years ago because of some carbon-14 dating of trees that they found on the Bering Strait. So he used that date, and he was doing some extrapolation of the genealogies that I showed you earlier, and he comes up with dates that for the flood to be 25,000 to 55,000 BC, and for Adam to be 90 to 50,000 BC. So this is, of course, is completely inconsistent with the Bible. If you have, for example, if you had Adam living 50,000 years ago, and if you only have a record of the genealogy for 5,000 years, then what good is it? So basically, he's with his viewpoint, he's negating the Bible, the validity of the Bible. So I just wanted to show that to you. So how did the flood occur? Okay, this is when it starts to get interesting. How did the flood occur? The Bible says that when the flood occurred, that God destroyed all flesh, including animals, men, and everything living. And this is just says, I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. And then he reiterates, and all flesh died. After the flood, it says all flesh died that moved on the earth. All flesh. And then birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth and every man. All whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died. So this gets re-emphasized, what happened. And it says in Genesis, after the flood, and so the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits, about 23 feet upward, did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. So it not only says that all the animals and humans died in the flood, but that the water level covered all the mountains at least 23 feet above the highest mountain. I found this is an incredible website if you ever get a chance to go there. This is a record of all the mammal fossils that were found. So according to the theory of evolution, these mammals would have lived after 65 million years. And you see about 500,000 fossils everywhere on the Earth. They're everywhere. Even down in Antarctica, you see mammal fossils. This is not supposed to be there, because if you have a mass extinction at 65 million years, what caused this mass extinction? How come these mammals, who were supposedly living more recently, how could they be fossilized? But it's there. The data is there. So it shows that there was more than one mass extinction. Well, actually, per the Bible, there is only one mass extinction. Per the evolutionary viewpoint, there have been 5 mass extinctions. And I'll tell you why there are 5. And why not 1? Okay. So another thing is, was the flood local or global? This is a discussion that well, did people live in the Mesopotamian area? They died, but the rest of the world, the animals survived and things. But well, here's the Bible said that all flesh was destroyed. So if the flood was local, then Noah didn't have to build an ark. He could just, move away to another area, away from this location, take his animals with him. He didn't have to collect the animals, and of course birds could fly. They wouldn't have to be in the ark. Noah was in the ark for about 8 months, so that was a long time. God promised after the flood never to destroy all flesh by flood. Now, there have been some really severe floods throughout history. One flood was in 1931 in China, where the estimate is 1 to 4 million people were killed by the flood. So God didn't say that He's not going to destroy, not going to allow floods to occur, but He's not going to destroy all flesh. There would be no death of all flesh. Another interesting point is that as far as we know, the ark was built in the Mesopotamian area, but it ended up in the mountains of Ararat. So here's a kind of a picture of what Mesopotamian area, as we know, was at the time of the flood. The civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamian here. So somewhere Noah lived here and built his ark here, but then he ended up on Mount Ararat, on the top of the mount. So as you can see the terrain, if the water had to be high enough for the water to carry the ark up to the mountains, it couldn't just stand in one location and not flow to the rest of the world. So evidence that this was a global flood, not a local flood to destroy all men. The start of the flood. The Bible gives a really interesting description of how the flood, where it came from. It gives the date with reference to Noah's birth. It says that when Noah was 600 years old, that the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. So this is an interesting description because, and it rained 40 days and 40 nights. The Bible says that the water came from the fountains of the great deep. There wasn't a big mega storm. It wasn't the water canopy idea that water was suspended in the atmosphere and at this time it discharged and came from above. But it says the water came from the fountains of the great deep. Now, the emphasis here is it came from the great deep. It wasn't just from subterranean water, but from the very deep part of the earth, great deep. And the other thing is it emphasizes that there was a failure of the crust, that it broke open and this water came up from above, and then it rained. So you have a connection between the fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven open. They come together. It starts with the fountains of the great deep breaking open, and then you have the rain. And then you see when it's over, the fountains of the great deep are stopped, and the rain stops. So the rain is actually a consequence of the fountains of the great deep breaking open. Noah, of course, wouldn't have known about this because all he saw was rain and whatever was falling around him. He had no idea what. But this is God's word, and we're finding out now that there's an enormous amount of water, subterranean water. I'll be pointing it out a little bit in a few charts, but they discovered recently, again, this is like in less than 10 years, that there's 3 times more water below the crust of the earth than there are in the oceans. These are not Christian, Bible-thumping people. These are the scientists that made the discovery that confirms that there's water there. This is a picture of the evidence of the continental divide, where it broke up, where the cracks opened. This is where we believe the cracks occurred and caused the continents to split apart. And later on, I'll show you that this particular area is still active. There's still water coming out from that. These are discoveries of hydrothermal vents. Okay, and so this is the evidence that the fountains of the great deep were actually open. There's scars. People liken the earth to a cracked egg. It's cracked all over the place, and these cracked eggshells are floating on top of the yolk. Okay, so the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. I like this illustration because it shows to some degree what happened. There was a violent event. The earth broke open, and this high pressure, high temperature water jetted up into the atmosphere, brought with it sand, mud, and silt, and came crashing down. So it wasn't like just a bad storm. It was a violent event. And so because of that violent event, the water and the mud and things that suddenly came back from the atmosphere, some of the water was turned into ice when it went high enough, and we'll see that. But it was an event that totally covered the earth and created the mass destruction. The end of the flood is recorded. It says the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So again, I mentioned this, that the two are not independent of each other. It wasn't like a big storm that suddenly ended and then the fountains of the great deep stopped. But that one was the consequence, the rain was the consequence of the fountains of the great deep breaking open. Okay, so this is kind of a key to understanding the mechanism for the flood, that the two are connected. The water comes up, and then it stops, and then we'll talk about where the water goes after the flood is over. I'm just going to go through this real quick. This just happens to show in the Bible the timeline from when Noah enters the ark. He waits there 7 days before the rain and this fountains of the great deep open. It rains for 40 days, but now what's interesting here is that in a matter of months, you have the water returning back to where it came from. So this is a challenge for people who believe that the water returned because the mountains and the continents were lifted up, and so the water drained down. That had to be really fast. Or the people who assume that the waters returned because the oceans were evaporating and depositing ice on the Greenland and Antarctica. But we'll see how this happened. It wasn't neither one of those. It returned rapidly, and it took about 8 months, 5 days for the water to drain back, another 2 months and 25 days for the earth to dry. Of course, you have to have the earth dry so that vegetation can grow, and the animals that are now coming out of the ark are able to to eat and survive. Okay, this is really key. The Bible says that the waters returned from the earth continually. The word return in Hebrew is sub. What it means is that the word itself means it returned to where it came from. It always means that. Always means that it returned to where it came from. It didn't just drain off the continents or return back to the, if you think of the water canopy theory, it didn't return back into the atmosphere. And these are examples where this word is used. It says that God said that from dust thou art and to dust thou will return. Again, talking about from where Adam came and where he's going after his death. Then the story of when Noah releases the dove. When the dove is unable to find a place to land, he returns back into the ark. Again, the same word is used here. And then in another instance, it talks about the handmaid of Sarah. When she runs away from Sarah, the angel tells him to return to your mistress and submit yourself to her. So it's always, the key point here is returning from where it came from. So this implies that if the water came from below the crust of the earth, it's going to return back there. But how does it happen? Okay, I think I kind of touched on this already, so I'll skip it. So I use my experience of thermodynamics on the flood to illustrate, to show you that it actually can happen without just by under gravity go back. So this picture I have shows what the conditions before the flood. So you see in the bottom there the mantle, and these are the temperatures that are estimated for the mantle. Is about 870 degrees Celsius. Above it is the subterranean water chamber. So we don't know what the temperature is, but I assume 700 degrees Celsius because it's close to the mantle temperature. And of course, heat is being conducted from the interior of the earth to the surface of the earth through the crust. I chose 10,000 atmosphere, and the reason I chose 10,000 atmosphere because later on, when we talk about the Greenland ice sheet and Antarctica, those ice temperatures were generated by water being exposed to very low atmospheric pressure. It has to be up into the 200,000 feet altitude for it to generate this super, super cold temperature. By the way, there's no explanation for that except for the Bible. They don't know why the temperature in the Antarctica ice sheet is minus 32 degrees Celsius. In Antarctica, it's minus 53 degrees Celsius. There's no mechanism. It's not your annual snowfall. So I chose the 10,000 so that I can eject the water high enough in the atmosphere. So now, the conditions during the flood, and so the water, the Earth's crust breaks, and then you have the water from underground being ejected high into the atmosphere. And it takes with it dirt, sand, it erodes the crust, and it ejects it up in the atmosphere. So what you have coming back down, depending on how high the water jet went to the atmosphere, you have snow, sand, silt. And we'll show you that this is exactly what they find in Greenland. They find a mixture of ice and silt, which is not supposed to be there. Or on the Sahara Desert, you find incredible amounts of sand. Okay, so this continues until the pressure in the subterranean cavity, the 10,000 atmosphere pressure, until it decays and comes to equilibrium with the water column above it. It keeps flowing until that happens. Once that happens, then flow coming from the subterranean cavity stops. Now, what happens after that is the water now starts to flow back into the subterranean cavity because it's colder, And as it seeps back into the subterranean cavity, which is still hot, 700 degrees Celsius, it cools that, and it continues to cool, and water continues to flow back into where it came from. So think of it like if you had a pressure cooker and you heated the water and you release the pressure in the pressure cooker, and all the water or whatever comes out of the pressure cooker. But now, when that's done, when it stops coming out of the pressure cooker, if you put that inside a swimming pool, insulating the side, it will suck water back into that pressure cooker, because the colder water coming into that pressure cooker that has the hot water cools down, the pressure drops, and it keeps sucking it back in. So that's what happens. Now, this actually is a kind of the thermodynamics of what happened there. Like I said, I use 10,000 atmosphere pressure. This represents condition 1 represents the origin before the crust breaks open. It's at 700 degrees and 10,000. And these numbers are not sacred numbers. This is just to illustrate the process of outflow and inflow without having any, just under gravity. It's just the nature of high pressure supercritical water. The curve down below, okay, this is a good one. The blue line represents the pressure in the oceans and the final pressure where the water starts to flow back into the subterranean cavity. It's about 80 atmosphere. It could be 100 atmosphere. It doesn't really matter, because the difference between 10,000 atmosphere and 80 atmosphere is not much. But what happens here, and this is the interesting thing, that supercritical water has this property, that when it's at a low pressure, it goes through a large change of density. So what you have here is that you start out with condition 1 before the flood. The crust breaks open, and it's flowing from 1 to 2, flowing into the ocean, flowing up and continuing to flow. And what happens is that in this pressure difference, 75% of the water that's contained in the subterranean chamber comes out. And when it comes out, the pressures equal now between the bottom of the ocean and the subterranean chamber. So then the next path is the refill. As I said, that you have ocean water that's much colder, minus 5 degrees Celsius. It could have been more than that. It could have been 10 degrees. Doesn't really matter. But it's so much warmer, so much colder than the subterranean chamber temperature. So as the water starts to flow back into the chamber at nearly constant pressure, you start refilling this, and you end up having the same density. 0.3 is the same density as 0.1. So you had outflow and then inflow. So it's amazing. So the Bible, where am I? The Bible is really amazing that it gives this description, and we can verify it through analysis. Again, those numbers can be different, but it basically shows the principle of how the water could go back in a very short period of time. So, is there water under the crust of the earth? Yes, obviously, or else I wouldn't be here. So, the Russians had a project was called the Deep Hole Bore Project. They did this back in the back in the 70s, I think. I didn't put the date down. But this is the deepest hole that they drilled down to. It's drilled down to 7.5 kilometers, the deepest. And they stopped drilling because probably run out of money, or it was getting too hot and they couldn't drill anymore. So what they found there in the several kilometers of depth, they found water at that location, which was a surprise to them. They didn't know there should be water down at that depth. But what is even more amazing is they discovered that in that flowing water, there were evidence of petrified plankton, 24 species, single-cell plankton. Now, these planktons live on the surface of the water because they are the ones who produce food and convert carbon dioxide to oxygen. So they're not supposed to be there, but they're there. So this, in a sense, validates the fact that the way you got these planktons down in inside the crust of the Earth was because the water flowed back, as we were saying, at the end of the flood. These are even more exciting. This is 2014. The scientists discovered evidence of vast water reservoir trapped hundreds of miles beneath the surface, capable of filling Earth's oceans 3 times over. So this is an article in Nature World News. Another article, 2017, there is as much water in Earth's mantle as in all the oceans. Just think about that. I mean, the Bible talked about this, that the water came from subterranean cavities. And now scientists are coming up with it independently. So this Stephen Jacobson, I think, was the one who was first credited with discovering water below the surface. He said, this is from a release. It said, the vast amount of water locked inside rocks of this deep region of the mantle will certainly force us to think harder about how it ever got there, or perhaps how it could have always been there since solidification of the mantle. So right now, with that, there's kind of like, what happened? We missed it. You know, the water didn't come from outer space through icy comets impacting the Earth over millions of years. This was already there, so they have to go back and redo their theories some more. This water is apparently locked up in this rock called ringwoodite. But what's interesting about it is that they said that it means that water on Earth may get pushed to the surface from below, even though it's locked up in these rocks called ringwoodite. It can occasionally be pushed back into the surface, contradicting previous beliefs that the water was delivered by icy comets. So this is what that rock looks like. So if you see one, you know what it is. So this is now exciting part. So what's the evidence that there is water under the Earth, other than the fact that they discovered these cavities that are below the crust of the Earth? Again, this is a recent discovery, hydrothermal vents that are located at the bottom of the ocean, and they're located along the fault line, the cracks between the continents. They're all sitting there. So the water is coming out from the hydrothermal vents, and this was discovered in 1977. You see the very energetic jet coming from below. Here's another picture of a different hydrothermal vent. It's continuously flowing. They actually measure the flow rate to be fairly high, 7 to 12 miles per hour, and it's coming from what we call the fountains of the Great Deep. These are not geysers. This has been incorrectly labeled as geyser. They're not geysers because geysers are not continuous. I worked on modeling geysers for the space program. The oxygen tank has an anti-geyser system. I worked on that and I analyzed that. So I know what a geyser is. This is not a geyser. So where are the hydrothermal vents located? Well, these stars represent the hydrothermal vent fields. There are thousands of hydrothermal vents at each of these fields. This is just what they discovered. They think there may be even more around that they haven't discovered. But the hydrothermal vents are located where the cracks are, where the water came out, it went back, and now now because it went back, it was colder. the geothermal heating is warming it up and it's starting to expand and come back out of the atmosphere again. It's like, you have your pot on with the gas, you put the lid on, and if you're not careful, the water will come out and overflow. So this is what we're seeing. We're seeing the overflow from the hydrothermal vents. Okay, so this is just an illustration, of course, of what people think what the hydrothermal and the fountains of the great deep look like with the magma. It's a good illustration, but... So, what's interesting is that the Bible talks about the waters being under the crust thousands of years before the recent discovery. So the Bible is not, just a book of stories. It's actually an excellent book that talks about history, that things that we have never known before. 100 years ago, people didn't know about the hydrothermal vents or the subterranean water reserve. The other thing is that's kind of interesting. I have this Bible reference here that the Bible talks about the crust of the earth being standing in water and out of water. So it implies not only just that there was the hydrothermal, the subterranean water reservoirs, but actually says that the earth is standing out of water and in water, whereby the world that was being overflowed with water. Here's another one in the Psalms. To him that stretched out the earth above the water. Now, before this discovery, this made absolutely no sense. How could the earth be stretched above the water? But now we see it's actually happened. And here's another one. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof the world, and they that dwell in it. For he had founded it upon the seas and established it upon the floods. So these are references to the fact that there's water under the crust of the earth. So I'm close to finishing with part 1. This is just a summary. There are no gaps in the Bible timeline from Adam to Christ. The date is 4,088 years. The date of the flood is 2400 BC, and we can define it by both from the Bible and also using secular history. The flood water came from below the ground and the fountains of the great deep, and the waters covered the entire globe. We'll see in the next couple of sections the devastation that happened. The waters flood returned back to the subterranean cavity under the effect of gravity, and it's verified by analysis. And one of the things that I think I bring to this discussion is that there's a lot of data out there, but there's no analysis to say, well, what does that data mean? And because sometimes the data is confusing, people ignore it. But the discipline is to analyze it, to see what it really, what the data says. The source of subterranean flow has been found in hydrothermal vents and is still leaking out. There's more subterranean water than water in the oceans, both liquid and trapped in rocks. So with that, I'm going to go to the next chapter.